Hello, everybody. My name is Sally Mewies. I head up the technology and digital team at Walker Morris. I'm joined by Luke Jackson, who's also a member of that group and works with me on lots of technology-related issues. This tech talk is about blockchain and smart contracts. The last time I did a talk on blockchain, it was probably about 5 years ago now. And since then, my sense is that interest in blockchain has waned a little bit, probably in part because it's been overshadowed by artificial intelligence and machine learning, which has obviously been gaining huge momentum. But in the last 6 months or so, we have certainly sensed in our team that there's a bit of a resurgence going on around blockchain. I think that's in part because people are seeing more practical examples or applications of how they can use blockchain in their businesses, but also I think it's driven because of its association and facilitation of smart contracts. So what we thought we'd do in this session is talk to you about what a smart contract is, explain to you how that interacts with blockchain and why blockchain is an important component, and then look at some of the legal issues that smart contracts raise. Luke, did you want to just say anything else in the introduction before we move forward into the slides?
Yeah, I think it's just worth touching on the fact that this initially is quite a technical area. We're going to explore some technology concepts so we can have a proper discussion about the legal issues and some of the use cases. Now, when I've spoken to people about blockchain and smart contracts before, often the conversation will go something on the lines of, have you heard of blockchain? Have you heard of smart contracts? And frequently the answer will be yes, but I'm not quite sure what they mean. What are they? I've heard about them, I've seen them. I'm not really sure what they are. So one of the things that we want all of the viewers to take away from this webinar this afternoon is a foundational understanding. When they see the concepts, blockchain, smart contracts, foundational understanding about what's meant by those, and that will then enable viewers to go away and read about them and learn and see the possibilities for how they use and where it might go in the future. I think we're going to, as I say, we're going to cover the technology, the terminology at the beginning. We're going to start with smart contracts. I think this might go a fair clip, might it, Sally, so that we can get to the interesting stuff for us, which is how it's used and how it impacts the law.
Yeah. Okay, so as I said, we're going to sort of go back to basics a little bit. So let's move on to have a look at what is meant by the term smart contract. So when people talk about smart contracts, they don't necessarily mean a legal contract as we understand it. The term smart contract is quite a broad interpretation, but at its very fundamental, it means a software code, a set of programming rules which are capable of executing a task or an activity or a transaction without any human intervention, and that's the critical piece here. So it's a piece of coding that performs a task automatically without any human input. Now, there are lots of examples of how code performs tasks automatically without human input in lots of areas of business and personal life that we encounter. But the interesting point about the smart contracts that we're going to be looking at here is that they typically sit on blockchain technology. They don't always, and they don't have to, but the smart contracts that we're going to look at in this session are those that sit over blockchain technology. That is going to be the focus. And just a quick point of order, when we talk, and Luke's going to be talking a lot about blockchain and we're going to be looking at different aspects of it, we're using blockchain in a generic sense. I mean, what blockchain is a part of technologies called distributed ledger technologies. DLT is sometimes how you see those written. And blockchain is one aspect of DLT. They're not all blockchain, but we're going to refer to that as a generic name because it's just easier and people have got an understanding of what that means. And it's important to understand that when people talk about smart contracts, they're not necessarily talking about a legal contract as we understand it. So I said that they're associated with blockchain, and we're going to have a look at what we mean by blockchain and what blockchain technology is. But before we do that, Luke, is there anything you wanted to just add to this section on smart contracts?
No, I think as you say, we spoke about blockchain there, and you mentioned DLT, distributed ledger technology. I think that's just an important thing to keep in the back of your head, because when you start to look at this, you will see DLT, you'll see distributed ledger technology and other things. They'll be used kind of synonymously with blockchain, and probably blockchain, although it sits under that bracket, it's just one element of it. So distributed ledger technology, we'll probably come back to some of those words shortly. Smart contracts, Sally, you mentioned this really is a technical definition rather than a legal, and I think that's an important point just to keep in your minds as well. The concept of a smart contract wasn't something that lawyers dreamed up. It really is a term derived from the IT industry. And you can kind of get that looking at the definition that we've given it there. That's not a legal definition, that's a technical definition. There's going to be some interesting uses that we'll come on to of how this concept of a smart contract might be something we build into our legally binding obligations now or in the future. But yeah, keep in mind that it's not a legal definition, it's technical. And for me, the key word that I associate with a smart contract when I think of smart contract, automation. It's an automated process. And if you focus on the word smart in the smart contract, we've all got smart devices, or most of us will have smart devices in our own homes. You might have an Alexa device or a Google device. You might have a Nest thermostat, a Ring doorbell. These are all pieces of technology that automate certain things in our lives. And a smart contract, a smart legal contract, which we will come on to, is that's getting at automating an element, or potentially most or all of our legal contracts. That's kind of the link to what we see on the screen, to where we're going to go. Sally, you mentioned that we're going to go into blockchain now to explore that concept, to see how it sits with the concept of the smart contract that we've talked about, and to kind of see how it bridges the gap from this IT concept, this idea dreamed up by the IT industry, to something that we might be able to use in the legal world in the near or medium to long-term future.
Yeah. And I think that the other point, you say automation, for me it's about control. This program, this smart contract executes and cannot be controlled by humans. So you can't stop it, you don't trigger it, it automatically executes.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, and maybe this is something we'll come on to when we get to talk about blockchain. For us, I think for the purposes of this webinar, it's more helpful to think of in the terms of what benefit does this technology bring? What does it do? Rather than what is it and how does it work? It's the so what, why does it make a difference? For me, it's automation. For Sally, as you say, this is about control. So looking at blockchain.
Hold the thought. And let's move on to what blockchain is.
Well, blockchain is, I'm going to describe it as a better way of keeping information. It's a technology that enables information to be held in a way that is complete, accurate, and infallible, or at least considered, for all intents and purposes, to be complete, accurate, and infallible. But what is blockchain? Blockchain is just a record of information. It's a list. You'll see it referred to as a ledger of information. I like to visualize it as like an Excel spreadsheet, and Sally, I know you can see it as like a big database, don't you?
Ever since I've sort of got to grips with blockchain many years ago, in my head it's like a massive database of information, the accuracy and integrity of which you can completely trust. And that's how I've sort of got my brain around it. I mean, that isn't exactly what it is technically, and if there are any technical people on this webinar, they'll probably be throwing their hands up in horror at that. But this is all about getting into your head what this is and how it operates so you can understand smart contracting. And
Absolutely, yeah, that's my analogy, and I'll stick with it for the next 45 minutes. But I think a spreadsheet database helps because it keeps in my mind, at least, like what we've got here is almost a blank framework for information to be input, and it goes to the point that blockchain isn't just like for a single purpose. There's a whole realm of potential applications that are being explored. In a sense, that makes it kind of hard to explain because it's this technology that enables so many things. But if you see it as a way of recording information, a database or a spreadsheet, and obviously one information and how you record it can enable to do different things, I think that's a good starting point and a good way to visualize it.
Yeah.
So go on.
Sorry, Luke. One of the reasons why it is infallible, accurate, complete is the way that it's held in the blockchain network, or the way it's held and stored on computers. And you're, Luke, going to just talk to us about why that is such an important attribute for blockchain technology in the next slide, aren't you?
Yeah, we said we wouldn't go too much into the how, so we can get to the more interesting questions of how does it affect us, so what does it mean to me, how's it being used in the legal world. But I think this element that we're going to talk about now of how blockchain technology is structured helps to begin to understand why it can be considered to be complete, accurate and infallible. And as you touched on, Sally, it's the idea of who holds this information. So the answer to that question is everyone. I'm going to explain that now with the use of some diagrams, but I think it helps to have that in your mind before looking at these, because there's lots of dots and lines on a page and it can look a little bit confusing. But let's take each of these concepts in turn, and then hopefully at the end we'll have a view of the way that a blockchain database, a blockchain ledger, is held, where it sits. So if you think back, let's start with a traditional way of record keeping, a traditional database, a traditional ledger. We might use the example, well, like the example, Sally, don't we, of the land registry holding a database of property title information. And that would be represented by the sort of drawing on the left-hand side of the slide there, the centralised way of holding information, a centralised database. And on that drawing, you've got the land registry in the middle there, and you've got any interested party who might want to access information that the land registry holds. They would go to them for that information. The information is centralised with that single party. The next step across is a decentralised way of holding information. And in that model, if that model were to be applied to the way of holding property information, you might have the land registry holding certain information, but you might have one or two other maybe government bodies that hold maybe the same information, so you can just go to different places for it, or it might be different places for slightly different things. Taking that one step further, in a distributed model, every party that might want to access the information already holds an active copy of it. Sally, can you see where that's going?
Yeah, so on the distributed model, and this is the real key to blockchain, is that the blockchain network, or the blockchain application, for want of a better phrase, is distributed across a number of what we call participants who all have their own piece of computer equipment, and they are holding a version of that giant database, as I like to think about it. And they all have the same version of it. No one of those participants, those little dots in the diagram on the slide, could represent a participant with a piece of kit working in a blockchain network. They've all got the same copy. They all have to agree and validate changes to it. And that's the second point that's really critical to blockchain, that the way that it evolves and changes involves all of the participants in the network agreeing to how that change is applied, and there's numerous different ways that can happen, all quite complex from a technical perspective. I'm not going to go there, but understand that the reason that it maintains its accuracy, its security, its effectiveness is because that you have got a number of participators in that network. And sometimes that could just be anybody in the whole community, a bit like the Bitcoin blockchain, or it might be kind of permissioned, where you've got people authorized to work in that blockchain network. But the key issue, as we've said, is that it's stored by many people, and its accuracy and changes to it are verified by many people. And that's why you can trust it.
Exactly. The information is distributed, and that's the key word from this slide, is that blockchain holds information in a distributed as opposed to centralized way. It doesn't sit in one single place, it sits in multiple places across the network almost simultaneously. And for the record, the database, or if it's a spreadsheet, for that to be added to, for it to be updated, all members within the network who hold a copy would need to agree that the updated version, the updated record in our spreadsheet or database is, one, accurate, all need to agree it says the same thing, and two, that the correct procedure has been followed to update it.
Yeah, and that's why it has these incredible properties, because in its purest sense, it's not controlled by a centralised authority. It's not controlled by a financial institution. It's not controlled by a government. It's not controlled by the land registry. It's controlled by all the people that operate it in the network.
Yeah, and that's what we've come on to on this slide, isn't it? We've said it's a distributed ledger. What does that mean in practical sense? What benefits does that bring? Well, it's threefold. It means the information can be considered accurate, because when information on a blockchain ledger is updated, every interested party who holds a copy of that information in our network is agreeing to that new entry. Someone's agreeing it's accurate at the time of updating. It's also secure because it's not held in a single place. So there's no single centralized point of failure. And equally, no single party can force an update to the ledger. No single party can, update their copy of the spreadsheet and say this is the new version, because all the other parties are holding a different version. All of the other parties haven't agreed to the change. So you can be confident that a single party can't force the record to be changed. And that idea of not being able to tamper with a blockchain ledger, not being able to tamper with information stored in the blockchain, is really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then the final point we've got there is efficiency, and it's the speed, I guess, would be another word for it, because all interested parties within a network already hold a copy of the information, whatever that information may be. You don't need to go to another intermediary, another third party to ask for it, which could take time, it could take cost, it could require cost. It just adds a layer of efficiency to process within the network to speed things up, because parties already have access to the information that they will need at their fingertips. Sally, we've talked a lot about different concepts and different terminology here. I think some practical examples might help to give this some context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shall we move on to that now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think what we want to do with this slide is just spend a few minutes with some different scenarios, thinking about how information is held today, not using blockchain technology, but the possible weaknesses or flaws in the way that information is held today, and then maybe think about how, if blockchain were to be incorporated into some industries, what that might mean, how it might improve things. So the first scenario that I want to pose would be, Sally, if you imagine you're going into the supermarket, you want to buy some salad that is organic, you insist it must be organic, you find some, look at the packaging, it says, this salad is organic, but how do you know that the what the label says is correct? How can you take confidence in that? The fact that the salad that you want to buy is organic. You can't really, because you've got to kind of take the packaging's word for it. But if you incorporated blockchain technology into this scenario, your knowledge of the supply chain would be different, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I trust Sainsbury's, but even maybe they don't know.
You can tell it's lunchtime, can't you? So I think... Sorry, go ahead, Sally.
Sorry.
Now I was just going to talk about how blockchain in the supply chain. Now, if we think of the supply chain of our salad in the terms of a ledger, a database of where that salad's been, how it was grown, and how it got to the shelves of Sainsbury's supermarket, you could see how that could sit in some sort of table on a list that might sit on a spreadsheet, for example. When it was grown, where it was grown, and who by, and the conditions on which it was grown that make it organic. You could then maybe see how it was treated it might be by a third party. That will be updated. That will be on our list of where it's been. All the way down the supply chain, how it was packaged at Sainsbury's, how they dealt with it, to how it got to your shelves. And I suppose this would be in the form of maybe a QR code or something, wouldn't it? Something that you could maybe scan, and it would just tell you at a glance, yeah, this is organic. Blockchain technology would give you confidence that the information provided on your organic salad was complete and accurate and infallible. Sally, do you want to talk about one of the other examples?
Yeah, I was going to pick up on art, actually. I mean, the benefits, I think, of blockchain technology is that where you have organic produce, like Luke has just said, or works of art, where the provenance of those products can be uncertain and clear, if they are captured in a blockchain technology, you can have confidence that whoever is stated in that technology to own the piece of art or the provenance of the organic produce is right. And you know that because of all the things we've just told you about how it's accurate, it's immutable, it can only be changed through very complex technological processes. So you can immediately see how using blockchain technology in many scenarios that we encounter day to day can bring benefits. The housing land registry one is a use case that's been trotted out many times over the last 5 or 6 years. And this kind of has at its heart the idea that if everybody's property ownership was on a blockchain, you kind of wouldn't need to go and do all the searches and checks that you have to do. And in fact, I think the land registry are exploring a possible use of that technology and have some pilots and trials going on at the moment. But that kind of gives you a sort of real life example of how blockchain technology could be utilised.
Poses an interesting question, doesn't it? By looking at different industries, you can then ask the question, in your own industry, where do you rely on information that's presented to you? What measures do you take to check out that information is correct, and what time is incurred in doing that? What cost is incurred doing that?
Yeah.
And then if a blockchain solution was introduced somewhere along that process, how would things change? How would things improve in your industry? Because if there's room for improvement, then probably at some point down the line, a company is going to come in with a blockchain solution. So there might not be one at the moment, but that's what's happening. That's what's happening right now. Companies are looking at industries, at blockchain technology and how it can be applied, where people require confidence in information and the solution, and how blockchain can be used as a solution to giving that confidence. Sally, I think we'll do a recap on what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I mean, so what we've said to you so far is we've explained to you about what a smart contract is. Smart contract in the very broadest sense, which is a piece of software code programmed to execute a transaction automatically without human input. We've talked to you about how smart contracts don't have to only work on distributed ledger technologies like blockchain, but they work very well when they're I think the technical phrase is they record onto the blockchain. I like to say sit on top of it. They work very well in that environment. We've explained to you that blockchain is a piece of technology that is very good for storing accurate information about transactions, activities, any piece of information you like. And it can be trusted to keep that record accurate, maintain integrity, and update it in a way that you know that that new entry into the blockchain is correct. Now, there's a tiny, tiny little point on infallibility. You have to kind of believe that this is totally and utterly trustworthy, because otherwise everything we say about automatic execution of smart contracts starts to get a bit woolly. But, very, very clever people could potentially hack into blockchain technology. My understanding is very, very difficult to do that. But if they did, the beauty of the technology is that it would be very, very clear that that had happened to all of the participants in the blockchain technology. So we are talking about it being immutable, infallible, and having this quality of integrity, because it is important that that is right to create this trust in the underlying technology.
That's kind of the challenge with getting your head around blockchain, isn't it? To an extent, you need to know what blockchain is to see how it can be applied. But because a lot of the applications centre around being able to suddenly trust information as it's presented, then you want to check the how the technology works, how the blockchain works, in order to be able to give yourself confidence that, this technology does mean that I can trust it. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into too much of the next, but hopefully this will be enough of an overview to go in and explore that a little bit further. But
all of that's extremely complex, The
last point on this slide, Sally, is this concept of trust by design, which we quite like, don't we? Because it can't trust, essentially, is at the heart of what blockchain gives. It means you can trust information like you presented. And the reason you can trust it is through the design, through how blockchain is structured, inherently built in are mechanisms that mean that the information is complete, that it's accurate, and it's infallible, at least for all intents and purposes, Sally.
Infallible-ish, if that is
Doesn't look so good on the slide, does it?
We're going to put ish after the word infallible, weren't we, Luke? We decided that would.
It's typical lawyers covering themselves.
Always an exception.
So, I think we're going to now move on to looking at how smart contracts and blockchains can be combined. As I say, for me, blockchain, I see it as a spreadsheet, essentially, and I see smart contracts as some method of automation. With that being said,
moving on to smart
contracts. Let's look at the two together.
So this is the combination, isn't it, the smart contracts and the blockchain, and this is where we're getting into how smart contracts might be used from a legal perspective. I said already that when a techie person, not a non-lawyery person who knows a lot about coding and blockchain, sees the word smart contracts, they won't think about the English law and the courts of England and Wales. They'll just think about a piece of code that executes automatically. And, again, those smart contracts that are not legal smart contracts sit very well on a blockchain. A lot of games work in that way. They sit on a blockchain, they execute automatically as people are playing the games. The beauty of smart contracts and blockchain from a legal perspective is because of the accuracy, and we've been hammering this home over and over again, accuracy and integrity of the information that sits in the blockchain. So the smart contract is able to rely on that accuracy, integrity to execute a process automatically. And then what it does is updates the blockchain with the output from that execution. And it provides evidence in the blockchain that the execution has occurred. So we're going to talk about some examples later on, but I'm hoping that you're starting to see that you've got this giant database in my head, this kind of smart contract that's code that sits over it, that interrelates with the blockchain and performs transactions depending on the nature of the blockchain and the nature of the activities.
I suppose it gives kind of two features then, doesn't it? It means that by storing the contract code on blockchain, you have the confidence that the code isn't going to be altered, tampered with to give you an outcome that you don't want or that's not envisaged.
Yes.
That would be feature number one. The feature number two would be that you can record contractual outputs or information you would want recording under a contract. You could record that on the blockchain itself, giving you the benefits of the blockchain, that giving you assurance that the information required by the contract is being recorded in a way that is complete, accurate, and infallible. So we'll just kind of sum this up with another phrase at the bottom here. Trust that performance has happened. It's trust that a smart contract, not legal contract is what we're going to come on to, has been performed or will be performed in the way that it's intended to be performed. So we touched on smart legal contracts, and we're going to distinguish our IT industry definition that we touched on at the beginning of the webinar with a more legal concept, aren't we, Sally?
We are. So smart legal contracts.
Smart legal contracts. What we've got on the slide here is what I hope represents a kind of spectrum of what smart legal contracts look like. Before we get into that, I want to clarify what I understand a smart legal contract to mean, and it will be a smart contract. So that idea of automation, a self-executing software program. That's also built on a blockchain, incorporates the blockchain technology and all the benefits that brings, but also meets the legal formalities required to make a contract at law, so offer acceptance, intention to create legal relations, all of that business. So it's kind of, we're taking the definition or the idea of a smart contract that we started with and just adding a couple more points, the legal formalities and built on blockchain to that to come up with this new concept, and the concept that we'll use for the rest of this webinar, and kind of the concept that when lawyers talk about smart contracts, that's what they're referring to. That's what we'll use moving forward. So we can see on the slide here that you've got a spectrum of what a smart legal contract looks like. I suppose the first point to note then is that there's no single form of what a smart legal contract is or will be. At the far end of the spectrum, on the right-hand side of that slide, you can see an entirely coded contract. So that's some way off at the moment, isn't it, Sally? We're not there yet. We're not all going to have to go away and do a coding course this afternoon. So don't worry about that.
Somebody who's done one and wants to say, I've got one.
Quite. That might, however, come in handy for other areas of the spectrum. If we have on the right-hand side the idea of a fully coded contract, and not shown on this slide, but the far left-hand side, I suppose would just be a traditional written agreement as we would recognise a contract today. And we can come somewhere in the middle would be these hybrids. Now, we've got this idea of, on the left-hand side there, a natural language contract, which is our traditional contract, but with the addition of one or two lines of software code, that would really just be around automating an element of performance. So not necessarily setting out the legal terms, but an element of performance. So an example that I quite like is maybe a particular technical standard or an industry practice being set out in software code, and a requirement that code is built into a finished product. So then that would automate the performance in accordance with given technical standard or industry requirement in the delivery of the performance. Somewhere in the middle, you've got the hybrid idea, which is the foundation of our contract will be a traditional written agreement, but the lines would be more blurred. There'd be some written terms and there'd be some legal terms drafted using software code. Sally, that spectrum, is that how it sits in your head?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got some sort of natural, when we talk about natural language on the left-hand side, it may be that could be written in source code, which is obviously English language, computer program, or it could be paper written. Again, with the hybrid, you could have some of it kind of in source code, some of it in object code with automated processes. I mean, I'm expecting in relation to legal contracts, and maybe I'll be proved wrong about this, that it's unlikely we'll have anything that's entirely coded. Well, certainly not for quite a while. We're more likely to be in the space of hybrid, where you've got some English language parts, natural language parts, but then some elements of it are formulated in code, computer code. That's kind of where I think we might go, and I think that's partly driven by the law being a little bit behind the pace, as it always is with emerging technologies, and there are needs for some work to be done, I think, around total and entirely coded agreements. That's kind of where I see it.
It's quite a radical shift, isn't it, from our legal system built for
yeah, certainly
on written language to turn on its head and replace it with software code. It's quite a journey, but at least conceptually, the ideas are of introducing a little to a lot of software code into written legal contracts.
Yeah.
And just one more point I wanted to touch on before we move on to the next slide. You might see references to on-chain and off-chain in this like conversation. On-chain is kind of software code, links to or on blockchain. Off-chain would be your written agreements. If you see that terminology, that's what's being talked about. So I think use cases would be helpful again, Sally. Want to move on to some of those?
Yeah, let's do that. So I think, again, just to bring this to life, it's really hard, I think, when you're thinking about this abstractly, just to understand it. We've done a lot of stuff here. We've talked about blockchain, which is complex technology. We've talked about kind of coded legal contracts, which, again, it is kind of alien to most of us who are working in the law. But if we just move on to the use case slide, Luke, I think this is quite helpful. These are fairly typical examples that people give of blockchain and smart contracts. And to be honest, they've kind of been around for quite a long time. But my sense is that they're just getting a bit more traction now. And people, I mean, certainly in the insurance world, there's lots of stuff going on in there which will undoubtedly include non-legal smart contracts as well as potentially legal smart contracts. But I think these analyses and these use cases are certainly getting more traction. So the supply chain is a really interesting one. And Luke's already talked about kind of tracing organic produce, but there's a bigger point, I think, for supply chain around how complex it is. You've got letters of credit, bills of lading, all sorts of financial transaction documents that I won't even pretend to understand, and the movement of those documents between parties as goods pass from the original supplier through to the through to the customer are complicated. So imagine a scenario where a blockchain stores information. It may not be able to store the actual letters of credit themselves, but information verifying where those letters of credit, where those bills of lading are held. And as the goods progress through the supply chain, smart contracts automatically execute payments based on where the goods are in that supply chain. And you can see how actually efficient that would be. It would all be dealt with in a piece of technology. There'd be no need for people signing things, faxing them through to other people, ringing people up to try and get things moving. You can immediately see the advantages of that. Again, digital assets, intellectual property assets, if you're trying to sell those, or you put them on the internet, or you put them in any kind of social technology environment, you do run the risk of piracy. We all know that's a big problem in the music industry, and I guess in the film industry too. If you had some kind of blockchain asserting your rights of ownership in that asset, controlling how that is downloaded and played, for example, and then the smart contract executes a payment, collects the money from the person who's downloaded it, executes the payment to the person who's entitled to license fees or royalties. Again, you can see how all of that is coming together.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that. So I guess the smart contract will be built into the audio file, and upon a play by a listener, it would, as you say, automatically trigger that payment obligation. And I think what this starts to do is cut out intermediaries, which is better in this case for the musician, because it, rather than the record label, management, Spotify, whoever, all taking a slice, it would enable the musician to sell their music much more directly to the end user. And I saw actually the other day that the very first blockchain music record had been made by Imogen Heath. So if anybody wants to have a look at that, that was good.
Yeah.
And I think stuff is happening, and there's lots of examples of that, isn't there, Sally, where things are kind of at the proof of concept stage. I think that's kind of where we are with a lot of these technology applications.
And I mean, we sometimes get people saying to us, oh my God, this is so complicated, I can't understand it, why would anybody ever get into this, why would anybody ever use it? And I think these examples here actually do demonstrate quite nicely, if you can get something to work effectively that delivers this kind of output, just how much time and cost you could eliminate from various transactions processes that are done quite regularly. And I think that in terms of moving forward.
A lot of these are quite narrow, focused solutions to specific problems, aren't they? And I think that's probably where smart legal contracts are at the moment. Narrow applications rather than that all-encompassing agreement.
Yeah. So should we move on and have a look in the sort of final quarter of an hour of just some legal issues, Luke? And we're not pretending that we've got all the answers to this, because there's lots of people consulting on various aspects of how this might work. But what we're doing is just floating some thoughts around what sorts of things you might need to think about. And certainly a branch, I think it's of the Law Society, isn't it, Luke, have looked at this at a kind of high level and have said really, in principle, they don't see any issue with contracting through smart legal contracts. They think that all of the rules can be adopted, bent, twisted, whatever words you want to use, to accommodate that. But there is further analysis going on by the Law Commission, and they're doing a very deep dive into analysing all of these aspects, all these legal issues associated with smart contracts in quite a lot of detail. I think also, I mean, where I think we're probably going to go is you'd have a natural language contract dealing with lots of things that can't just be executed as code. And then you'd obviously have somebody programming a software, some software code to kind of work with your natural language contract, and even that in itself throws up lots of interesting points, doesn't it, about who takes responsibility if the person codes it incorrectly. You know, how do you work, what's the relationship between the person who codes that contract and the person who writes the original contract, if that's a lawyer. All of those really interesting issues, which I think will start to become explored as time goes on and people start to try to adopt some of this technology.
Yeah, I think in my view, it's a lot of the progress here will be driven by tech companies coming up with solutions to specific problems, and where those solutions include blockchain technology or smart contract triggers, the law and the contracts will just have to follow.
Yeah.
But the law, and I think, and where the Law Commission is at the moment, is looking for how it's used, and a framework for governing use won't come. It's a little bit chicken and egg. It won't come until there's sufficient use cases to base it on. So I suppose this idea that of drafting a smart contract isn't going to be something that happens based on lawyers developing, although us developing the law or the way we draft contracts. It will be driven by tech companies saying you need to find a way to deal with this new functionality, these new mechanisms. You need to find a way to deal with them in your contracts, and that's what the court's going to have a look at. That's what the Law Commission will look at. We'll come on to, won't we, where they are and where they are at in that process. But there has at least been some acknowledgement that theoretically there's not a fundamental problem with a smart legal contract existing, a contract being built around the idea of automation or an element of automation.
Yeah.
But I think we've got interpretation on the screen there, and I think that's quite a good one to illustrate one of the problems that's being looked at. This idea of our bank of case law being built on interpretation, meanings of words, phrases, legal terminology. If that is replaced or supplemented by source code, well, there's no interpretation history for that. So how is that dealt with? What if the two conflict? What if the source code for the software doesn't do what the written language, the legal terms say it should do? And that's what you got to introduce this, Sally. The tension that might exist if there is a lawyer drafting the contract and a software developer looking at the smart element.
I mean, all our case law has been sort of based certainly in interpretation. So you're looking at kind of object code contracts, which are sort of numbers and symbols and are based on the meaning of natural words. So that clearly is quite difficult, and taking a sort of natural approach to that meaning is going to be quite difficult in a coded contract. I mean, even around forming a contract, we've got these principles that have to be in existence before a legal contract is formed. So you've got offer and acceptance, you've got intention to create legal relations, you've got certain formalities, you've got consideration, which presumably is not too difficult to deal with. But how does offer and acceptance work in a sort of fully automated environment? Intent to create legal relations is really all around words and conduct. Well, how does that translate? So you can see a pattern developing here of very well established legal principles being quite difficult to interpret, not impossible, and that there's definitely a willingness and a desire to move forward on this, but being quite difficult and needing some further guidance, probably from the courts or probably from the Law Commission, on how this can be looked at. You've got things like evidence in writing. If something's got to be evidenced in writing, then object code probably doesn't satisfy that requirement. You've got formalities for deeds. They have to be in writing, they have to be witnessed. Well, there's no witnesses to the automatic execution of a piece of code, so that will be challenging. I think rectification is interesting, Luke, because of what we said about immutability. You can't change it, so if it's wrong, how do you rectify that contract?
Yeah, and that brings me on to another one of the questions, which is around variation of a contract. You said that once code is or records are stored on a blockchain, they can't be altered, it can only be added to.
Yeah.
How do you vary that? What both parties agree to vary, but the way the technology is structured and designed doesn't allow you to do it. I think what you would have to do is do some sort of addition that had the effect of changing things. But these are all the interesting questions that the Law Commission is currently grappling with.
I mean, I think you'd have to code it to be capable of coping with variations, and that is quite challenging. Although I think there is some work being done in the insurance world where that kind of is being looked at. So there may be a possibility to do that, to sort of accommodate code that might need to vary certain elements of what's going on, maybe duration, for example. Mm-hmm. But it's difficult, and certainly rectification and mistake and frustration, all those old English law doctrines, how they would apply to a coded contract is quite difficult to see. I mean, there's one with structured contract, wasn't it, that we talked about?
sorry, I didn't hear that, Sally.
I'm saying this breach of contract is the one on the final part of the diagram. You know, what if that is code induced? It's not actually a breach by either party. It's the code doing something wrong, or maybe the code was programmed incorrectly, as you said, by a third party. How will all of that be rectified? And I think because of these points, certainly early doors, it seems to me that it's going to be pretty difficult to do this without a natural language contract that maybe deals with some of these issues. When things do arise like this, which aren't necessarily regularly occurring items, but do happen from time to time.
This is so interesting, but I'm conscious of time, and I think we're going to have to move on to the where we are. We've touched on this.
I just wanted to say a quick word on GDPR.
Yeah, just go on.
Because there's other points there on jurisdiction and law, but I did want to just say a quick point on GDPR, because clearly the whole concept of data protection is kind of the antithesis to what blockchain is doing. You can't change it, you can't delete it. So I think there will need to be some thought around how do we apply our data protection principles to personal data that is kind of immortalized in blockchain technology. And I know that a lot of the technology does store information in hashes and it's kind of pseudonymized, but my understanding of what our information commissioner has said on that is that she still considers that to be personal data, even where it's pseudonymized. So, I'm sure there will be a solution to these data protection issues, but you can see that there are some challenges, particularly in that area around this, I think.
Yeah, it's safe to say there are a few wrinkles that remain needing to be ironed out. Fortunately, the Law Commission is looking at this now, aren't they? In December, at the end of last year, they issued a call for evidence to get some industry feedback about how smart contracts are being used, and they're going to use that to ascertain whether legislation will need to be introduced to start to govern these. So it's a very much a wait and see at the moment. I believe that call for evidence closes in March of this year. So there will be developments probably in the next couple of months where everything's a little bit up in the air at the moment, Sally, I think is the current status of the law.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody is interested, I mean, we probably are going to make some commentary around the Law Commission review. So if anybody is interested in commenting, or they've got any experiences that they think would be really relevant around smart legal contracts, please email Luke or me, because we will take into account any comments that we receive about that. Would be really helpful, I think. So that would be a good thing.
The other point on that slide, which we've touched on, this idea that progress is, there's some progress being made by the Law Commission on the legal side, but a lot of the progress is going to be driven by the tech companies. And you may already be seeing references to blockchain or smart contract solutions in your business. And if not, you might be encountering some of the problems that we've talked about, that blockchain or smart contract solutions might sound. So I think it's a keep an eye out for them now and know what some of the issues are. Go away and do the further reading, but it's think about how this technology could benefit in your specific circumstance. Because as we've said, it's got such potential for broad application that it's unfortunately we can't cover it all in this one. That is rapidly coming to a close, Sally. So unless you've got anything to add, we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, we've got... Sorry, yes, move on to that slide.
We've got some key takeaways, haven't we?
Yeah.
We've touched on the terminology, and we said at the start that for those who weren't clear on the concepts, smart contracts, blockchain, at the outset, we at least want people to come away knowing that. So smart contracts, as we say on the slide there, a computer program that automates, it self-executes, and if you add in the legal formalities and build on blockchain, that's where we get to the smart legal contract that we now envisage becoming part of our jobs in the future. Blockchain, what is that? It's a record of information. To me, it's a spreadsheet. To Sally, it's a database. But remember, the way it's designed makes the ledger of the information complete, accurate, and infallible. And then we've summed up law there in 2 words. It's still emerging. Let's see the outcome of this Law Commission call for evidence.
Yeah, and we'll be monitoring it closely, and we'll be putting some information out there as things progress, won't we, Luke?
Yeah.
We've had a number of questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. But we will email you with our thoughts on those questions. So thank you for those people who've contributed questions, and apologies that we've kind of run out of road to answer them.
We have some follow-up notes as well, don't we, Sally? So we've covered things at a high level, and what we've put together a kind of summary document that also includes some links to resources that we found useful in getting our heads around how the technology works, how it's being used. So we'll send that out to viewers. And I think, as we've said, there'll be some really interesting applications in business now. So I think we'd love to hear from people about what their experiences are like now, wouldn't we, Sally?
Yes, absolutely. Really interested. The more know-how we share, I think the more traction this will get, and the more informed people will become, which is the point, isn't it, really?
Yeah. So I think we've got, obviously, we touched on at the beginning, this is the latest in our series of Tech Talk webinars. I believe there's another one on the horizon that we should mention before we finish.
Yeah, can you remember what the title of that one is, Luke?
I can't remember the title, but I believe it's a data protection one looking at trends.
Yeah, it is. So do join us for that, absolutely. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.